The airport was chaotic, filled with passengers hurrying in every direction, announcements crackling through the speakers. But in a single, jarring instant, all movement halted. A loud crack rang out, harsh, echoing through the crowded boarding gate like a gunshot. An elderly woman's cane was violently knocked from her trembling grasp. Clattering sharply onto the polished tile floor, a gasp rippled through the gathered crowd as the elderly woman instinctively raised a shaking hand to shield herself, her pale blue eyes wide with disbelief. Standing rigidly in front of her was a flight attendant, her name tag gleaming coldly under the fluorescent lights. Caroline Whitmore. Caroline's face twisted with disdain, eyes blazing with impatience and irritation as she pointed aggressively toward the boarding gate. "I told you clearly to move aside," Caroline snapped, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "First-class boarding isn't for people like you." A heavy, shocked silence enveloped the terminal. Everyone stood frozen, their eyes darting between Caroline and the elderly woman. No one dared to intervene, though whispers of discomfort began to stir. But the elderly woman, known as Meredith Winslow, didn't cry out or protest. Her hand trembled slightly, but with incredible dignity and quiet defiance, she bent slowly, painstakingly, picking up her cane from the ground. Straightening with a grace that contrasted starkly against Caroline's aggression, Meredith looked directly into Caroline's eyes. Her gaze wasn't angry. It was something far deeper, far more powerful. A quiet, piercing calm that unsettled even the hardened flight attendant. In a steady, quiet voice that resonated with a quiet power, Meredith uttered words that sent chills down the spines of everyone within earshot. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your career." Before we continue the story, leave a comment below, letting us know from where in the world you're watching today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. A short while earlier, the airport lounge had been filled with the gentle clinking of coffee cups and murmurs of conversation. In a secluded corner by the expansive window sat Meredith Winslow. Her hands were delicately folded atop the carved ivory handle of her elegant cane. Dressed in a refined but understated emerald green dress, a delicate brooch pinned carefully above her heart, Meredith's silver hair was carefully styled into soft waves, lending her an air of quiet sophistication to most travelers rushing by. She appeared to be just another elderly woman, patiently awaiting her flight. Nearby, a sharply dressed younger man, Alexander Hartwell, glanced up from his laptop, noticing Meredith's dignified presence. He instinctively stood up, politely gesturing toward his seat with a respectful nod. "Would you like my seat, ma'am?" he offered kindly. Meredith raised her eyes to meet his, offering a gentle, appreciative smile. "Thank you, young man, but I am quite comfortable." Alexander nodded respectfully, returning her smile warmly as he resumed his seat, unaware of the true identity and significance of the graceful woman seated just steps away from him. At the bustling check-in counter, flight attendants moved briskly, their clipped voices efficiently directing passengers. Among them, Caroline Whitmore stood out. Tall, severe, and self-assured, her dark hair pulled tightly back, accentuating sharp features that rarely softened. Caroline had long served the first-class cabin, and she wore her authority like an invisible crown, making snap judgments about who was worthy of her exclusive domain. Her eyes scanned the lounge, swiftly categorizing passengers. She acknowledged those who fit her ideal image: expensive suits, designer luggage, authoritative demeanors, while swiftly dismissing anyone who fell short of her standards. When her gaze briefly landed upon Meredith, Caroline paused, her lip curling slightly in disdain, before quickly moving on. barely registering the elderly woman's presence. Her attention returned sharply to the high-profile business executive she intended to serve attentively on this flight, completely unaware that Meredith Winslow was no ordinary traveler, and certainly someone whose dignity should never be questioned, and other high-profile passengers who expected nothing less than flawless service. As the announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, the elderly woman, Meredith Winslow, calmly rose from her seat. She carefully adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and tightened her delicate grip on the polished ivory handle of her cane. Meredith moved toward the boarding gate unhurriedly, each step deliberate and composed, as though time itself held no sway over her. Other passengers hurriedly wove around her, eager to settle into their seats, barely noticing her quiet dignity as they rushed forward. When Meredith reached the gate, she gracefully extended her boarding pass to the attendant stationed at the entrance. Caroline Whitmore. Caroline barely glanced at the ticket before abruptly lifting her hand, blocking Meredith with visible irritation. "Ma'am, this line is exclusively for first-class passengers," Caroline stated crisply, her tone superficially polite, yet dripping with contempt. Meredith slowly raised her gaze, meeting Caroline's dismissive eyes directly, her expression calm yet unreadable. "I'm fully aware," she replied gently, her voice steady and composed. Caroline exhaled sharply, irritation deepening on her face as she studied the boarding pass more carefully, her brow furrowed in disbelief, clearly skeptical that an elderly woman with such modest appearance could possibly hold a legitimate first-class ticket. "Are you absolutely sure this is your ticket?" Caroline asked condescendingly, tilting her head mockingly, clearly anticipating Meredith to admit some error or misunderstanding. Meredith, however, remained impeccably calm, showing no offense at the degrading question. "Yes, I am quite certain," she answered quietly, unwavering. Caroline pursed her lips impatiently, glancing behind Meredith as if expecting a caregiver or companion to step in and clarify the supposed misunderstanding, yet no one came forward. Meredith was unmistakably traveling alone. Sighing exaggeratedly, Caroline shook her head dismissively, her voice now raised slightly, intentionally audible to those around. "Clearly there's been some kind of mistake," she said patronizingly, as if explaining a basic concept to a confused child. "First class is reserved for specific passengers," she continued, waving her hand dismissively toward the economy boarding gate. "You belong over there." Meredith stood motionless, her serene gaze never wavering, undisturbed by Caroline's increasingly disrespectful tone. After a deliberate pause, Meredith finally spoke again, her voice firm and authoritative. "There is no mistake. This is my seat." Caroline's jaw visibly tightened, anger flickering across her face. She'd encountered countless passengers before, those attempting to sneak into first class with fake tickets or illegitimate upgrades, and had absolutely no tolerance left. Frustrated, she held Meredith's ticket up against the overhead lights, scrutinizing it dramatically for signs of forgery. "I don't know how you managed to obtain this," Caroline muttered under her breath, her voice laced with suspicion and disgust. "But you won't be sitting here today." Behind Meredith, the boarding line grew tense as curious onlookers began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Sebastian Drake, the young businessman who earlier offered Meredith his seat, tensed visibly, hesitating as though he wanted to intervene, but choosing silence. Caroline's patience snapped completely. Her voice became harsh and cutting, openly humiliating Meredith. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Step aside immediately." When Meredith remained resolute, not giving an inch, Caroline's composure broke entirely. With a sudden, shocking motion, She violently slapped the boarding pass out of Meredith's hand. The sharp sound pierced through the terminal like a whip crack, causing passengers to gasp audibly. Meredith's cane fell from her grip, hitting the polished floor with an echoing clatter. A stunned silence descended over the gate area. Abigail Mercer, a woman standing nearby, covered her mouth in horror. Sebastian's jaw tightened with anger, his eyes wide with disbelief, yet Caroline seemed utterly indifferent to their reactions. "I told you to move," she snapped coldly, voice raised without an ounce of remorse. But Meredith, instead of recoiling or protesting, slowly bent down to retrieve her fallen cane, her movements graceful yet powerful in their calm dignity. Rising once more to her full height, she met Caroline's glare directly, her clear eyes radiating a quiet, formidable strength that made the attendant instinctively step backward. The tension hung heavy between them, almost suffocating. Then Meredith spoke softly, yet clearly, her calm, quiet voice sending an unmistakable chill through the air. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your entire career." The silence grew thicker, stifling, almost tangible. Then, in a voice so chillingly calm, it froze the very air around them, Meredith spoke. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your life." Caroline scoffed, an uneasy laugh forced from her throat, though her eyes shifted nervously beneath Meredith's unwavering stare. "Ma'am, I don't have time for these theatrics," she said coldly, her voice dripping with contempt. "If you refuse to move, I'll have security escort you out immediately." The crowd around them began murmuring louder, discomfort and disbelief rippling through the gathering passengers. Sebastian Drake clenched his jaw tightly, visibly wrestling with whether or not he should intervene. Abigail Mercer, the woman who had gasped in horror moments earlier, anxiously scanned the surrounding faces, desperately hoping someone would speak up. Yet nobody did. They simply stared in silent anticipation, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Unfazed, Meredith stood her ground, her composure extraordinary, despite the humiliation she'd just endured. She calmly retrieved her fallen cane, grasping it firmly with a dignity that only deepened Caroline's irritation. Her voice remained steady, poised and firm, cutting through the tension. "I have a first-class ticket, and I intend to board this flight in my rightful seat." Caroline drew a sharp, irritated breath through clenched teeth, shaking her head incredulously. "Unbelievable," she muttered bitterly under her breath. Without another glance at Meredith, Caroline spun sharply toward Leah Bennett, a younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Leah, call security. Now." Leah hesitated visibly, her eyes darting uncertainly between Caroline and Meredith. Something about this entire exchange felt deeply wrong. Meredith Winslow wasn't behaving like someone who had made an error or been caught doing something dishonest. She displayed none of the expected signs of panic or nervousness. Instead, she radiated a calm authority that made Leah pause. Caroline's impatient glare intensified, however, forcing Leah to reluctantly reach for the intercom. But before Leah could summon security, a commanding voice interrupted sharply. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned simultaneously to see a senior airline official striding confidently toward them. Richard Montgomery moved swiftly, his perfectly tailored suit reflecting an aura of indisputable authority, his badge clipped prominently to his chest. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold, yet fiercely authoritative. Ignoring Caroline entirely, he approached Meredith directly, respectfully inclining his head. "Mrs. Winslow," he spoke with clear reverence, "my sincerest apologies for the unacceptable delay. Your seat is ready, and we're honored to have you aboard." Caroline blinked in stunned disbelief, her mouth opening briefly before snapping shut again. Her voice trembled, barely audible. "Wait, what?" Only now did Richard turn toward Caroline, his gaze steely and unforgiving. "Step aside immediately, Miss Whitmore," he ordered quietly, his tone brooking no argument. A heavy, oppressive silence engulfed the terminal. Caroline felt the ground beneath her sway as panic began tightening its grip around her throat. Her fingers clenched around Meredith's boarding pass, the crumpled ticket trembling slightly. "There must be a misunderstanding," she stammered weakly, desperately forcing a strained chuckle. Richard interrupted her sharply, his tone ice cold. "There is no misunderstanding. Did you even bother checking the system before publicly humiliating this passenger?" Caroline's throat constricted, suddenly unable to respond. She had scanned the boarding pass briefly, but never bothered verifying the passenger information in the system. Her stomach churned with sickening realization. She had made a grievous assumption. Richard's eyes narrowed further, reading her silence clearly. Without waiting for Caroline's reply, Richard turned sharply toward Leah. "Leah, kindly escort Mrs. Winslow to her rightful seat immediately." His voice left absolutely no room for debate. Leah quickly stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Respectful, right this way, Mrs. Winslow," she offered softly. As Meredith passed, she cast a final penetrating glance toward Caroline. It was a look devoid of anger, yet filled with profound disappointment, a silent indictment heavier than any words could convey. Passengers instinctively stepped aside, parting to allow Meredith through, the rhythmic tap of her cane echoing with undeniable authority. Caroline felt her heart pounding painfully in her chest, humiliation burning fiercely beneath the intense gazes fixed upon her. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear him clearly. "When this plane takes off, you and I will have a very serious conversation," he warned quietly, his tone dangerously calm. Caroline swallowed hard, the murmurs of disapproval from the watching passengers burning her ears. The solid ground beneath her suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. She stood, frozen, helpless, as Richard walked away, his quiet threat lingering in the air like an invisible judgment. Around them, the passengers returned slowly to their own conversations, but furtive, judgmental glances lingered upon Caroline, each look questioning the depths of her terrible misjudgment. Meanwhile, Leah carefully led Meredith through the jet bridge, her movements gentle and deferential, sensing clearly now that this was no ordinary passenger. This elderly woman carried herself with an unmistakable authority, an aura of understated but undeniable importance that had been grossly underestimated. Unlike Caroline Whitmore, Leah Bennett carefully guided Meredith Winslow into the first-class cabin, her gestures gentle and respectful. Leah sensed immediately that there was something unique, something distinctly powerful about Meredith. The way Richard Montgomery had addressed her had made Leah realize this was no ordinary passenger. "I'm truly sorry for what happened back there, ma'am," Leah said softly, her voice sincere with regret. "I should have stepped in earlier." Meredith turned toward Leah, offering a gentle, reassuring smile as she settled comfortably into her seat, carefully placing her cane by her side. "It's quite all right, my dear," Meredith replied graciously, adjusting her silk scarf slightly. "Unfortunately, I've encountered many people like her in my lifetime." Leah hesitated, curiosity overcoming her professional restraint. Lowering her voice respectfully, she asked softly, "May I ask, who exactly are you?" Meredith's eyes sparkled briefly, a hint of mystery dancing in her gaze, but she chose not to answer directly. Instead, she merely leaned back into the plush first-class seat, with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes, silently asserting her rightful place. Leah understood the subtle cue, nodding gently and stepping away, her mind buzzing with intrigue and admiration. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Caroline Whitmore forced herself toward the galley, each step mechanical. Her shoulders tense with humiliation. Her hands trembled as she reached for a cup of water, her mind desperately racing to process what had just unfolded. Why had Richard Montgomery reacted so sharply? And why had the elderly woman, Meredith Winslow, walked away as if she had triumphed effortlessly? Before Caroline could take a single sip, the plane's intercom crackled ominously. "Miss Whitmore, report to the cockpit immediately." The paper cup crumpled slightly in her clenched hand, panic surging through her veins. Caroline had never been summoned to the cockpit before a flight in her entire career. A cold dread settled heavily within her as she slowly turned toward the cockpit, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. Her mind desperately attempted to rationalize the summons. Perhaps it was merely procedural. Perhaps Richard just wanted a private word before takeoff, but deep down, she already knew better. As Caroline stepped cautiously inside, the atmosphere hit her instantly. A palpable, oppressive tension. Captain Jonathan Reynolds sat upright in his seat, hands steady on the controls, but his eyes were cold, sharp, and accusing. On the cockpit's monitor, connected via video call, was a familiar face. Stephen Caldwell, one of the airline's highest-ranking corporate executives. His gaze alone was enough to drain all color from Caroline's face, sending a fresh wave of panic crashing through her. Richard Montgomery stood silently to the side, arms folded tightly across his chest, clearly displeased. The heavy silence in the cockpit felt like an unbreakable chain tightening around Caroline's throat. Stephen's voice broke through first, firm and chillingly calm. "Miss Whitmore, explain immediately why you publicly humiliated a passenger traveling in first class." Caroline's mouth went dry instantly. "I didn't humiliate her," she stammered weakly, desperately trying to find footing. "I simply thought there was some kind of error with her boarding pass." Stephen narrowed his eyes, his tone sharpening. "Did you actually verify that supposed error before denying her entry and assaulting her dignity?" Caroline froze, unable to form a coherent answer. Captain Reynolds exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples in obvious frustration. Richard Montgomery's patience had worn thin, his voice slicing through the tension. "Answer the question immediately." Caroline's voice shook with shame. "No," she admitted painfully. "I made an assumption." Stephen Caldwell exhaled slowly, his voice dropping dangerously lower. "Miss Whitmore, do you have any idea who you just insulted and publicly shamed?" Caroline's fingers trembled nervously against her uniform. She struggled desperately to connect the dots, unable to comprehend how the elderly woman she had so blatantly dismissed could be anyone other than an ordinary passenger. "She was just an elderly passenger," she murmured, voice barely audible. Stephen's expression darkened further, his voice icy and deliberate. "That woman was Meredith Winslow, the chairwoman and founder of this airline." The revelation hit Caroline like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Captain Reynolds glanced sideways, his expression stony and unreadable. Richard Montgomery didn't even attempt to conceal his disappointment and disdain. Stephen Caldwell continued relentlessly, his voice carrying the weight of her devastating error. "You publicly humiliated the most powerful woman in this industry, a woman who single-handedly built this airline from nothing, in front of passengers, crew members, and staff who will never forget your behavior." Caroline felt her knees weakening beneath her, her chest constricted painfully, her mind reeling with disbelief. She had publicly struck, shamed, and humiliated the airline's very founder, the one person who commanded absolute respect from every level of this organization. Stephen let the silence linger painfully before delivering his final blow. You have one chance, exactly one, to fix the damage you've caused. You will return immediately to Mrs. Winslow, publicly apologize to her in front of every passenger who witnessed your disgraceful behavior, and personally ensure she receives impeccable, exemplary treatment throughout this entire flight. Refuse or fail in any way, and your career will end the very moment this plane touches down. Caroline's throat tightened violently. Her pulse thundered loudly in her ears as Stephen's words echoed relentlessly within her mind. Meredith Winslow, founder, chairwoman, the most influential woman in aviation. How could she have been so blindly arrogant, so deeply ignorant? She forced herself to speak, though her voice felt distant, foreign. I didn't realize. You didn't realize what? Richard's voice cut through harshly, impatience flaring unmistakably. That she didn't fit your preconceived idea of a first-class passenger? Caroline flinched visibly, the bitter truth stinging her deeply. That's not, Stephen interrupted sharply, coldly unyielding. Miss Whitmore, if you had recognized her name, if you had any inkling of her true identity, would you have dared treat her as you did? Caroline opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. They all knew the brutal truth. If she had known Meredith Winslow's true identity, she would have shown nothing but absolute respect. Her silence betrayed the harsh reality, hanging heavily over the cockpit, undeniable. Captain Reynolds shook his head slightly, visibly troubled. Richard exhaled sharply, disappointment etched deeply into his face. Stephen merely nodded once, as though expecting exactly this result. Go, Stephen instructed coldly. You will issue a full, unequivocal, public apology immediately. You will personally escort Mrs. Winslow to her seat. Understand clearly, this is not a request. It is your only opportunity to retain your position. Fail, and you will never wear this airline's uniform again. Caroline nodded stiffly, shame burning fiercely beneath her skin. Understood, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Captain Reynolds offered no support. Richard Montgomery, no sympathy. Caroline turned, each step back toward the cabin, excruciating. The instant she stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt every passenger's eyes upon her, judgment radiating openly from their stares. They might not have known every detail, but they certainly knew enough. The murmurs and whispers from the boarding gate had followed her onto the plane, and now Caroline could feel their heavy weight pressing down upon her like an inescapable spotlight. Now, every step Caroline Whitmore took toward Meredith Winslow felt like an agonizing march of shame. Meredith sat gracefully in her seat, entirely at ease, her cane placed neatly beside her. Leah Bennett lingered close by, watching carefully, uncertain how the situation would unfold, sensing that this was far from over. Caroline stopped stiffly beside Meredith, her hands trembling visibly as she forced herself to utter the words she'd never imagined she'd have to say. Mrs. Winslow. Her voice cracked noticeably, betraying her profound discomfort. She swallowed, desperately trying again. I must sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. Meredith turned her head slowly, meeting Caroline's anxious eyes with a serene expression that held an unsettling intensity. Something mysterious, almost piercing, lay behind the elderly woman's calm gaze. The silence stretched painfully between them. Passengers nearby subtly leaned in, curiosity piqued. their whispers intensifying. Even Leah held her breath, uncertain yet captivated. Caroline felt a fresh wave of humiliation burn through her. She'd openly belittled Meredith, treated her like an annoyance, dismissed her worthiness without a second thought, and now Caroline herself stood diminished and humiliated. She inhaled shakily, forcing herself onward, her voice trembling with deepening shame. "I misjudged you. My actions were wrong. I showed you disrespect in front of everyone here." Meredith didn't respond immediately, deliberately allowing the words to linger heavily in the charged air, ensuring Caroline felt their full weight. Finally, she nodded once, her expression composed. "I accept your apology," she replied quietly. Caroline exhaled slightly, relief flickering briefly across her face, believing that at last the ordeal was over. But just as she began to turn away, Meredith calmly lifted her glass of water, took a delicate sip, and added something that instantly caused Caroline's stomach to drop. "Now please repeat that apology for them." The air inside the cabin shifted instantly, growing colder, thicker. Caroline blinked, her heart sinking deeper into dread. "Repeat it for who?" Meredith gestured gracefully toward the rows of passengers. "For all those who witnessed your behavior, who heard you demean and humiliate an elderly passenger, who saw you slap the hand of the very woman who built this airline from the ground up," Meredith said calmly, her voice steady and clear. "I've accepted your apology personally, but they deserve to hear it too." Caroline felt the blood drain rapidly from her face. A chill ran through her, an overwhelming wave of dread and humiliation washing over her as every passenger's eyes now openly stared, awaiting her words. The aircraft's gentle hum underscored a deafening silence, thick with tension and judgment. Her body went rigid. Apologizing privately had been mortifying enough, but publicly admitting her error, openly acknowledging her prejudice and arrogance, felt utterly crushing. Caroline felt indignation rise within her briefly, anger that no passenger had stepped forward earlier, yet now eagerly awaited her public downfall. Why should she bear this shame alone? Yet Robert Ellington's warning was unmistakably clear. Without genuine remorse, her career would end before the plane even reached its destination. Caroline clenched her fists tightly at her sides, then slowly forced her arms to relax. She swallowed painfully, feeling the judgmental gaze of Richard Montgomery from the front of the cabin. His arms crossed, offering no mercy, only stern expectation. She had created this humiliation herself, and now she had no choice but to face it head-on. Drawing a ragged breath, Caroline raised her voice, just loud enough to carry, though each word felt like tearing a wound further open. "I owe an apology to every passenger here." An immediate ripple of murmurs ran through the cabin. Several passengers shifted, focusing intently now. Sebastian Drake, the businessman who earlier had nearly intervened, raised an eyebrow sharply, his gaze unwavering. Abigail Mercer, the woman who had gasped audibly at the earlier humiliation, watched Caroline with quiet, yet pointed satisfaction. Forcing herself onward, Caroline continued, her voice trembling yet firm enough to be clearly heard, each word a struggle against her battered pride. "Before boarding, I made an unjustified assumption about a passenger. My actions toward Mrs. Winslow were disrespectful and completely inappropriate. I questioned her right to sit in first class without any valid reason, and I humiliated her publicly." The murmurs intensified, shock mingling with acknowledgement among the passengers. They had witnessed Caroline's earlier contempt, heard her biting, condescending tone, but hearing the apology out loud carried an entirely different, heavier weight. Caroline's pulse thundered in her ears, yet she forced herself to lift her chin, facing her accountability openly, even as her cheeks burned with shame. My behavior was unprofessional, unfair, and utterly unacceptable. For this, I sincerely apologize. A deafening silence followed, painfully oppressive. Caroline wasn't certain what she had expected, perhaps some acknowledgement or murmurs of forgiveness. But instead, the passengers only stared, their silent judgment an unbearable weight pressing down upon her. At last, Meredith Winslow broke the silence, her voice calm yet authoritative. "Thank you for your apology, Ms. Whitmore, but I want you to understand something clearly." Caroline reluctantly turned back toward Meredith, dread filling her gaze, anticipating the inevitable question that would deepen her shame. Meredith leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and unwavering, directly locking onto Caroline's. If I had been just another elderly passenger, if I had held no position or status, would you be standing here right now, apologizing in front of all these people? The question struck Caroline like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her visibly shaken. They all knew the answer. Had Meredith Winslow not been the airline's founder and chairwoman, Caroline would never have faced consequences, or even second thoughts. She would have continued her day, secure in her arrogance, untouched and unapologetic. Passengers shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes, others waiting tensely to see if Caroline would dare deny the bitter truth. Caroline finally spoke, her voice barely audible, filled with painful honesty. "No, I wouldn't." Meredith studied Caroline silently, searching for sincerity or perhaps remorse. After a long, deliberate pause, she gave a slight, knowing nod and leaned back comfortably into her seat. Caroline's stomach twisted sharply as she turned, desperate to escape the scrutiny, when Richard Montgomery's commanding voice abruptly halted her retreat. "Ms. Whitmore," he said sternly, his voice neutral, yet carrying unmistakable weight. "You will personally attend to Mrs. Winslow's needs for the remainder of this flight." Caroline froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. This wasn't simply a punishment. It was a clear, public assertion of Meredith Winslow's rightful authority. For the remainder of this flight, Caroline would serve as a visible example of her own severe misjudgment, a constant reminder of her humiliation and the consequences of her arrogance. Meredith simply picked up her glass of water, leaning back quietly with calm authority. Her presence alone, elegant and composed, would serve as a powerful reminder to everyone aboard, particularly Caroline Whitmore, that dignity, respect, and humanity should never be judged by appearance alone. Now, instead of retreating to the galley to hide from the passengers' judgmental eyes, Caroline Whitmore would be forced to personally attend to Meredith Winslow, the very woman she had publicly shamed. Meredith, unbothered and serene, simply picked up a novel and slowly turned the page, silently reinforcing a clear message: this wasn't over yet. This wasn't over. Caroline felt her entire body tense at Richard Montgomery's stern instruction. "You will personally escort Mrs. Winslow for the remainder of this flight." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a direct command, and one she couldn't afford to ignore. A part of her wanted desperately to protest, to claim that any other attendant could manage the task. But Caroline knew she had pushed her luck too far already. The humiliation of publicly apologizing had shattered her pride, yet this punishment felt even more excruciating. The murmurs throughout the cabin had subsided, but the silence remained oppressive, thick with unresolved tension. The passengers were no longer just spectators. They now watched attentively, waiting to see how Caroline would navigate her harsh new reality. Beside her, Leah Bennett hesitated, visibly uncertain whether she should offer assistance. But Richard Montgomery's unyielding stare made it clear there would be no negotiations. Caroline took a sharp breath, forcing herself to turn stiffly toward Meredith, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "If there's anything you require during the flight, Mrs. Winslow," she managed to say through clenched teeth, her voice strained and almost inaudible, "please do not hesitate to ask." Meredith didn't immediately look up from her book. Instead, she deliberately finished the sentence she was reading, letting the moment stretch uncomfortably before finally raising her eyes to meet Caroline's gaze. Meredith's expression held neither smugness nor visible satisfaction, only the same serene, dignified authority she'd carried from the start. "I'll keep that in mind," Meredith said simply, her voice calm yet final, before calmly returning her attention to the pages of her novel. The dismissal was absolute, carrying the weight of Meredith's quiet dignity. Caroline felt her cheeks flush painfully as she turned to the front of the cabin, forced now to remain in full view of every passenger. No escape, no chance to hide her disgrace. Richard Montgomery, clearly satisfied that justice had been firmly asserted, gave Caroline one final, decisive glance before striding purposefully toward the cockpit. Leah lingered briefly, casting Caroline a cautious glance filled with something, perhaps pity, perhaps uncertainty. "I can help you if you need anything," Leah whispered gently. Caroline tightened her jaw, pride wounded yet refusing Leah's sympathy. "I can handle it," she muttered stiffly. Leah nodded reluctantly, clearly unconvinced, and with one final, sympathetic glance toward Meredith, she stepped away, leaving Caroline isolated and exposed. Standing awkwardly alone, Caroline felt every gaze piercing into her back. Passengers subtly stole glances, feigning interest in magazines or in-flight entertainment, but undeniably fixated on her humiliation. Sebastian Drake, the young businessman who had witnessed it all, no longer hid his observation. He openly studied her, fingers rhythmically tapping against his armrest, his expression neither mocking nor fully compassionate, merely observant, as if witnessing a lesson he doubted Caroline had fully grasped yet. Caroline forced herself to stand tall, though internally she felt twisted and diminished. She had never felt smaller. The weight of her disgrace was overwhelming, pressing relentlessly upon her. As the flight continued, Caroline tried desperately to maintain a facade of professionalism, to perform her duties mechanically as though nothing had happened. Yet she couldn't ignore Meredith's presence. Each time she passed the elderly woman's seat, the quiet authority emanating from Meredith's calm demeanor intensified Caroline's discomfort. Not because Meredith did anything, but precisely because she did nothing. She merely existed, reading quietly, occasionally sipping her water or glancing thoughtfully out the window. Yet now and again, Meredith's calm eyes flickered toward Caroline, lingering for just a moment, not in anger or contempt, but in quiet, powerful observation. And somehow, this silent scrutiny was infinitely worse. At one point, Caroline carried a fresh tray of refreshments through the first-class cabin. As she approached Meredith's seat, her steps faltered slightly. She hesitated, debating internally whether she should speak or silently place the glass and retreat. But Meredith noticed her uncertainty and raised her gaze calmly, her expression unreadable. "I brought you some fresh water," Caroline said quietly, her voice noticeably weaker than usual. Meredith offered a subtle nod, placing her book gently onto her lap. "Thank you," she replied softly, her eyes never wavering. Caroline's hand trembled slightly as she placed the glass on Meredith's tray table. The water wobbled, spilling slightly before landing with a quiet clink. Caroline immediately withdrew her hands, humiliation burning fiercely at her rare moment of clumsiness. She never faltered, never fumbled. Yet here she stood, vulnerable and visibly shaken, in front of Meredith's piercing gaze. As Caroline straightened and prepared to escape, Meredith's gentle voice halted her once again. "You've been employed by this airline for a long time, haven't you, Miss Whitmore?" Caroline stiffened instantly, wary. "Yes," she responded cautiously, uncertainty evident in her voice. Meredith studied her quietly, thoughtfully, then nodded once in acknowledgement, her calm authority unshaken. "Then you of all people should understand the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect." Caroline felt her chest tighten painfully. Meredith's softly spoken words struck deeper than any harsh reprimand. Her subtle yet profound rebuke hung heavily in the silence between them, a gentle but devastating indictment of Caroline's earlier actions. Caroline's throat tightened, her pride shattered anew under the weight of Meredith's quiet, powerful truth. And in all that time, Meredith Winslow continued calmly, her eyes gently probing Caroline Whitmore. "Has anyone ever questioned whether you truly belonged here?" Caroline's stomach twisted painfully at the piercing question. She knew exactly what Meredith was asking. Had anyone ever doubted her competency? Had anyone dismissed her before she had a chance to prove herself worthy? The answer was obvious. Of course not. Caroline had always walked confidently through the cabin, never experiencing scrutiny or condescension. Never once had she been made to feel out of place, yet that was exactly how she'd treated Meredith. Caroline's mouth went dry. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to claim it wasn't about Meredith personally, that she had merely been enforcing rules. But deep down, she knew it would be a lie. For the first time in her long career, Caroline Whitmore had nothing to say. Meredith didn't press further. Instead, she calmly lifted her water glass, took a slow sip, and returned to her book, the moment left hanging in the air with devastating clarity. Caroline turned away, but the weight of Meredith's question followed her like a haunting shadow. For the first time, it wasn't just humiliation she felt. It was something deeper, sharper, more difficult to shake off. Shame. She moved through the first-class cabin like a ghost, each step heavier than the last. Every glance from passengers reminded her vividly of the moment she'd lost control. She had spent her career commanding respect, enforcing order, ensuring flights ran flawlessly. But now she was the one being taught a painful lesson. Caroline tried desperately to distract herself, pouring drinks, straightening trays, offering strained mechanical smiles. Yet her mind kept circling back to Meredith's piercing words. "Has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here?" Caroline already knew the answer, and it sickened her. At the front of the plane, Richard Montgomery stood silently near the galley, arms folded across his chest, observing Caroline's stiff movement through narrowed eyes. She could feel his scrutiny tracking each hesitation, each falter. "You're struggling," he finally remarked quietly when she approached. Caroline bristled defensively. "I'm fine," she muttered, reaching hastily for a tray of refreshments. Richard sighed softly, shaking his head. "No, you're not." Caroline clenched her jaw, refusing to respond. Richard leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear, each word heavy with meaning. "You've been doing this job for a long time, Whitmore. Long enough to know better than to behave as you did today." Caroline stiffened sharply, but Richard pressed on relentlessly, voice calm yet firm. "You made an assumption about Mrs. Winslow. It wasn't about tickets or protocol. It was about what you personally believed a first-class passenger should look like. Caroline's fingers dug painfully into the edge of the galley counter. "I didn't mean—" Richard's voice cut sharply through her feeble excuse. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did." Caroline flinched slightly, but held her composure, straightening her shoulders, voice clipped and strained. "I already apologized." Richard studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze probing deeply. Finally, he nodded slowly, his voice soft yet cutting. "Yes, you did. But do you truly understand what you're apologizing for?" Caroline's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to snap back indignantly, claiming she understood perfectly that she'd simply misjudged a passenger. But deep inside, she recognized what Richard was truly asking. Not whether she understood her mistake, but whether she understood the bias that had fueled it. Unable to confront that reality, Caroline turned sharply away, fidgeting nervously with napkins that didn't need adjusting. "I need to get back to work," she murmured stiffly. Richard didn't push further. He stepped back, allowing her space, his final words lingering meaningfully. "Then get back to work." As Caroline moved through the cabin, Richard's words echoed relentlessly. Passengers quietly settled, meals were served, drinks carefully placed. Yet the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Caroline was no longer the respected, confident attendant. She was now an object lesson in humility, watched closely by every passenger who had witnessed her downfall. Sebastian Drake, the businessman who had seen everything unfold, caught Caroline's eye as she passed his seat. "Quite the day, isn't it?" he remarked casually, swirling his glass with deliberate ease. Caroline forced a brittle smile. "Just another flight," she responded lightly, feigning composure. Sebastian smiled slightly, clearly unconvinced. He glanced deliberately toward Meredith Winslow, serene in her seat, calmly flipping a page. Turning back to Caroline, his voice lowered with pointed observation. "I fly first class regularly. I've seen flight attendants like you. Strict, efficient, no tolerance for nonsense. Usually I respect that." Caroline's eyebrow twitched, anticipating the sting. "Usually," Sebastian repeated thoughtfully, taking a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving her. "But today I saw someone who decided she had the right to judge who belonged and who didn't." He paused, allowing his words to sink in deeply. "That's not respect. That's bias." Caroline felt his words strike like a physical blow. She wanted desperately to turn away, to dismiss him just as she'd dismissed Meredith. But she couldn't, because deep down, she knew he was right. Sebastian didn't press further. He simply returned calmly to his drink, conversation finished. Caroline turned stiffly away, the heaviness in her chest growing unbearable. For years, she'd prided herself on following strict guidelines, believing herself professional, fair, and competent. But today, she'd come face to face with a harsh truth. She had twisted those standards to justify her own prejudices. Caroline moved numbly through the cabin, haunted by thoughts she'd tried to suppress. Each glance, each whispered word from the passengers felt like an accusation, underscoring her failure. The hum of the aircraft became background noise as voices, Richard's, Sebastian's, Meredith's, repeated relentlessly in her mind, confronting her with uncomfortable truths she couldn't ignore. She judged Meredith before the older woman ever spoke a word, instantly assuming she didn't belong in first class. Had Richard not intervened? Had Meredith Winslow not been? Meredith Winslow, Caroline's bias would have gone unnoticed, unquestioned, uncorrected. The realization felt like a gut punch, leaving Caroline hollow and painfully exposed. A sudden crackle of the intercom jolted her back to reality. The captain's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Caroline straightened instinctively, smoothing her uniform in an attempt to shake off the overwhelming shame. She moved on autopilot, checking seatbelts, securing trays, going through familiar motions she'd performed countless times before. Yet her mind lingered back at the gate, back to the exact moment she'd made a disastrous judgment, a decision she'd never once second-guessed until now. She reached Meredith Winslow's seat last. The elderly woman sat poised, her seatbelt already securely fastened, quietly watching the city emerge through the window below. For a moment, Caroline simply stood there, unsure what, if anything, she should say. Before she could decide, Meredith spoke softly without turning. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Caroline tensed slightly. "Thinking about what?" Meredith finally turned to face her, eyes unreadable, yet compelling. "About why you did it." Caroline opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Meredith was right. She had been questioning herself since the moment she left the cockpit, since publicly owning up to her failure. Standing before Meredith, all excuses evaporated. For the first time, she confronted herself honestly. The plane jolted gently as the landing gear extended. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt strangely still, heavy with unspoken truths. Caroline finally exhaled shakily. I don't know why I did it," she admitted quietly. And for the first time, it wasn't an evasion. It was honest, raw truth. Meredith studied her thoughtfully, nodding slowly. "Then, perhaps it's time you find out." Caroline swallowed painfully, recognizing she needed to face her biases directly. She wasn't certain she could repair this damage, or even deserved to. But one thing was clear. This oment, this mistake, would follow her far beyond the end of the flight. The wheels touched down with a firm yet smooth landing, a gentle murmur stirring among passengers. Seatbelts clicked open instinctively as a calm voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination." Caroline drew a shaky breath, preparing herself to face whatever consequences awaited her beyond the aircraft doors. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us today." The familiar announcement washed through the cabin, accompanied by the rustling of bags, quiet conversations resuming, and the impatient shifting of passengers preparing to disembark. Yet Caroline Whitmore felt none of her usual relief or satisfaction upon landing. Instead, an unfamiliar dread settled deep in her chest, a gnawing apprehension that made her stomach twist painfully. She stared anxiously toward the jet bridge, already sensing that whatever awaited her beyond the aircraft doors would not be good. At the front of the first-class cabin, Richard Montgomery was speaking quietly but urgently into the in-flight phone, his posture rigid, clearly coordinating with ground operations. Caroline noticed the subtle tension in his movements. This was more than just a standard landing procedure. Meanwhile, Meredith Winslow remained poised, entirely unruffled, as she slowly gathered her belongings, her movements elegant and unhurried, betraying no sense of urgency. As Meredith reached gently for her handbag and cane, her eyes briefly flickered toward Caroline. The look was subtle, yet unmistakably weighted with meaning. Caroline forced herself to maintain her composure, standing straight despite her internal turmoil. She had apologized. She had served Meredith dutifully through the flight, but somehow it still felt painfully unfinished. The seatbelt sign finally switched off with a gentle ding, prompting the passengers to rise, calmly reaching for their belongings. First-class passengers moved at their customary unhurried pace, adjusting jackets and carefully retrieving designer bags. Sebastian Drake smoothly stood up, adjusting his suit jacket casually, before turning to Caroline with a measured glance. "Well," he remarked softly, his tone smooth yet pointed. This was certainly memorable. Caroline said nothing, her expression rigid. Sebastian paused, studying her thoughtfully before nodding slowly. "You'll remember today for a long time, I imagine." Caroline felt something tighten sharply within her chest, unwilling to admit how deeply correct he was. Without awaiting her response, Sebastian turned, stepping confidently from the plane into the jet bridge, leaving Caroline to gather her nerve for what lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, Caroline steadied herself, trying desperately to regain composure despite her trembling hands and leaden feet. She turned back toward Meredith Winslow, who was calmly adjusting the strap of her elegant handbag, gripping her polished ivory cane lightly, radiating the same steady authority she'd demonstrated from the start. Meredith showed no eagerness to exit the aircraft. Instead, her movements were measured, calm and deliberate. At last, Meredith's eyes found Caroline's once again, studying her closely, as if examining an unsolved puzzle. Caroline felt exposed, acutely aware of Meredith's quiet yet profound scrutiny. Then Meredith spoke quietly, her voice carrying undeniable authority. "Walk with me." Caroline blinked in surprise, momentarily unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" Meredith nodded subtly toward the open jet bridge, her expression gentle, yet unyielding. "Walk with me," she repeated, clearly indicating this was not a request. It was an expectation. Every muscle in Caroline's body tightened in resistance, desperate to remain behind, to escape what awaited her. But Richard Montgomery's commanding voice swiftly sliced through her hesitation. "Go," Richard instructed, his tone firm and uncompromising, making it unmistakably clear that Caroline had no choice in the matter. Caroline clenched her jaw, exhaling sharply through her nose, and nodded stiffly in acknowledgement. As Meredith Winslow rose gracefully from her seat, Caroline reluctantly fell into step just behind her, following her into the jet bridge, feeling as if she were walking toward her own judgment. The short walk through the jet bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, every step magnified by Caroline's anxiety. As soon as they stepped into the bustling airport terminal, she felt an immediate shift in the air, a sense of expectation, of something awaiting her. Meredith moved slowly but confidently, her cane gently tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. Caroline followed closely, forcing herself to maintain a professional posture, even as panic surged inside. Passengers instinctively parted from Meredith, not merely due to her age or appearance, but because she carried an aura of undeniable presence, of quiet yet commanding authority. Caroline had spent years orchestrating flights, projecting strength and control. But now, walking beside Meredith, she felt utterly powerless as the terminal opened before them, crowded with travelers and filled with the usual airport chaos. Caroline's heart jolted sharply. Ahead stood a group of airline executives gathered near a restricted access point. At their center was Stephen Caldwell, the airline's top executive, his presence formidable and coldly authoritative, and beside him stood airport security officials. Caroline's breath caught painfully in her chest, her steps faltering slightly before she quickly forced herself forward. Meredith never broke stride, approaching the assembled group without hesitation. Caroline could feel her future closing in rapidly, the consequences she had dreaded becoming terrifyingly real. Executives straightened immediately as Meredith Winslow approached, their expressions respectful, yet undeniably tense. Stephen Caldwell stepped forward first, greeting Meredith with utmost professionalism. "Mrs. Winslow," Stephen began smoothly, inclining his head respectfully. "I trust your flight was enlightening?" Meredith offered a small, knowing smile. "Oh, indeed it was." Stephen's sharp gaze shifted pointedly to Caroline. His tone turned cold, unequivocal. "Miss Whitmore, we need to speak with you." Caroline felt her fingers tremble slightly at her sides, dread tightening her throat. "Sir, Stephen raised a hand sharply, cutting off her attempted explanation. "Not here," he stated flatly. "Come with us." Caroline felt her stomach plummet. At that moment, Meredith calmly stepped forward, her gentle yet firm voice resonating clearly through the tense silence. "Miss Whitmore understands the gravity of her actions," Meredith stated evenly, her gaze firm and clear. "I'm confident she is prepared to fully accept responsibility. Isn't that right, Miss Whitmore?" Caroline's throat tightened painfully. Throughout the flight, she'd tried convincing herself that her humiliation, her public apology, had already paid the price. But now, standing before the airline's senior executives, airport security looming behind them, she realized the true repercussions had only just begun. Her career, her reputation, her very future was about to be decided. And for the first time in her life, Caroline Whitmore wasn't sure if there was any way left to salvage her career or her dignity. She stood frozen in place, her mind struggling to grasp the gravity of the scene unfolding around her. The sounds of bustling airport terminal seemed muted, distant beneath the crushing weight of reality pressing upon her chest. This wasn't merely a reprimand, it was a reckoning. Stephen Caldwell stood unwavering, his expression unreadable, yet carrying absolute authority. The security officer standing close by conveyed everything Caroline needed to know. This conversation would not be quiet or discreet. Beside her, Meredith Winslow waited patiently, her expression composed, offering neither anger nor vindication, only a calm, resolute expectation. Caroline understood that Meredith intended her to face the full consequences of her actions, and now there was nowhere left to hide. "Miss Whitmore," Stephen repeated firmly, his voice cutting clearly through her tangled thoughts. "Please come with us." For the first time in her distinguished career, Caroline hesitated. She had always been in control, always the one leading and directing others. Now, standing on the receiving end of scrutiny, being instructed to follow, to explain herself, she felt reduced, exposed, and painfully vulnerable. Caroline forced her legs to move, each step heavy and reluctant, as she followed Stephen and the security officers toward the airline's executive offices. It felt disturbingly close to an arrest, though she knew technically it wasn't. Passengers lingering in the terminal glanced toward her, some openly curious, others quickly turning their heads away, pretending indifference. Yet she felt their gazes, judgmental whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. Just as they'd echoed throughout the cabin, they reached a set of pristine glass doors bearing the airline's prestigious emblem. Behind these doors lay Caroline's fate. Stephen swiped his badge across a discreet panel, the doors unlocking with an audible click. He gestured for her to step inside. Caroline hesitated briefly, casting one final glance toward Meredith, who had quietly seated herself in the lounge area outside, still calm, collected, yet watching her carefully. Meredith's gaze conveyed something Caroline couldn't quite decipher. A silent message of expectation, perhaps empathy, or maybe a challenge to confront her mistakes honestly. Unable to interpret it fully, Caroline turned away, stepping through the doorway, her breath catching as the doors sealed shut behind her. Inside, the conference room atmosphere was chilling, not in temperature, but in intensity. The polished, immaculate surface of the long conference table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lighting. At the table's head sat James Whitmore, Senior Operations Manager, his sharp eyes locking onto Caroline the instant she entered. Flanking him were two other senior executives, each with thick files placed ominously before them, undoubtedly documenting her actions. Caroline's professional life was now condensed within those folders. "Sit," James instructed, indicating a chair at the opposite end of the expansive table. Caroline obeyed silently, lowering herself stiffly, her spine rigid with tension. The security personnel took positions near the door, unmoving sentinels guarding against escape or disruption. James leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "You know exactly why you're here," he stated quietly, each word deliberate. Caroline forced herself to nod, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." James studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Then please," he said evenly, "explain exactly what happened on this flight." Caroline's instincts screamed for her to defend herself, to insist she'd been doing her job, following protocol, maintaining order and efficiency. But deep down, she recognized the truth. Those were empty excuses, masks hiding her bias. Drawing a painful breath, Caroline chose honesty. "I made an unjust assumption about a passenger," she admitted slowly, her voice steady but filled with regret. "Because of that assumption, I treated her unfairly." James didn't move, didn't visibly react. He simply waited, eyes assessing her carefully. Caroline forced herself onward, each admission more difficult than the last. "I publicly humiliated her. When she resisted, I put my hands on her." James finally leaned back slightly, his expression still unreadable. "Do you fully comprehend what you've just admitted to, Ms. Whitmore?" Caroline felt her fingers tighten reflexively against her lap, her voice strained yet resolute. "Yes, sir." The executives exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her frankness. James exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Ms. Whitmore, you've been with this airline. How long?" 10 years, Caroline replied quietly. 10 years, James repeated deliberately, shaking his head slowly. "Then you understand perfectly well that your actions constitute grounds for immediate termination." Caroline felt her stomach clench painfully. She had anticipated those words, but hearing them aloud made it vividly real. James flipped open the thick folder in front of him, quickly scanning the contents. "We have detailed passenger statements, a formal report from Captain Reynolds, and a complaint filed directly by Miss Winslow herself." Caroline's breath caught sharply. She hadn't realized Meredith had officially documented her complaint. The weight of this revelation pressed down painfully upon her. James closed the folder, resting his hands deliberately atop its cover. "The only reason you're seated here right now, rather than already escorted from this building, is because Ms. Winslow herself requested you be given the opportunity to speak before any final decision is reached." Caroline's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, she requested that?" James maintained his calm gaze, unyielding. "Yes." Caroline struggled to process this revelation. After everything she'd done, after publicly humiliating Meredith, Why would the woman whose dignity she'd shattered offer her any chance at redemption? Caroline glanced toward the glass doors, beyond which Meredith sat patiently, composed and quietly observant. The sight of Meredith's steady composure sparked something within Caroline, not fear or humiliation, but a fragile, cautious hope for redemption. Turning back to face James Whitmore, Caroline exhaled slowly, deliberately. "I know I deserve termination," she admitted, her voice subdued yet clear. "But I don't want my final act at this airline to be defined solely by my mistake." She lifted her chin, forcing strength into her voice. "I want a chance to demonstrate that I can truly learn from this." James raised an eyebrow skeptically, assessing her carefully. "And exactly how do you propose to accomplish that, Ms. Whitmore?" Caroline hesitated briefly. She didn't know precisely how she'd manage it, but for the first time in years, she was determined to try. "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted honestly, "but I am ready to do whatever it takes." A heavy silence settled over the room as her words resonated deeply. James studied her closely, expression cold yet intrigued, while the other executives exchanged cautious glances. For the first time in a long while, Caroline felt the power of her own vulnerability, not as weakness, but as a potential path toward genuine growth. And unconvinced, even the security officer standing quietly by the door appeared to be waiting to see if Caroline Whitmore truly understood the gravity of her actions. She swallowed, forcing down the lump forming painfully in her throat. Throughout the flight, Caroline had tried to convince herself she'd done enough, that apologizing and enduring humiliation had sufficiently made amends. But sitting here, beneath their penetrating stares, she now understood the bitter truth. Apologizing wasn't enough. Simply claiming she had learned a lesson meant nothing without proof. James Whitmore leaned forward slowly, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished surface of the conference table. His gaze was steady, authoritative. "Miss Whitmore, do you fully grasp why the situation is so severe?" Caroline inhaled sharply. Caroline inhaled. She had anticipated this question, mentally prepared for it. But now, faced with the necessity of speaking the words aloud, their weight felt crushing. She thought back vividly to the moment she had stopped Meredith Winslow at the boarding gate, the careless ease with which she had dismissed her, how she'd never even attempted to verify Meredith's ticket properly, how she'd already decided in her mind that Meredith simply did not belong in first class. That was the raw, painful truth, and it was unbearably ugly. Caroline forced herself upright, shoulders back, confronting the truth head-on. "I told myself I was just following protocol," she admitted quietly, her voice clear but strained. But that was a lie. James raised an eyebrow slightly, his tone calm but sharp. "Then, what exactly were you doing?" She exhaled slowly, confronting herself openly. "I was making a decision based on my own assumptions." The silence that followed was deafening, but Caroline felt a shift in the room. She hesitated briefly, then pushed forward. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to expose her real motivations. "I looked at Mrs. Winslow, and I immediately assumed she didn't belong in first class," she confessed openly. "I didn't verify her ticket properly, and when she resisted, I let my frustration take over. I placed my hands on her." Caroline's stomach twisted sharply with shame, yet James's gaze remained unwavering. "You're acknowledging that your actions weren't merely a mistake, but driven by bias?" The word bias stung deeply, tightening in her chest, yet Caroline could no longer deny its reality. She nodded slowly, painfully honest now. Yes, admitting it felt like removing a blade embedded deep within her chest, excruciating yet strangely liberating. For the first time, She wasn't saying it merely to save her career, nor to appease those around her. She was acknowledging it because, at last, she genuinely understood it. James leaned back slowly, folding his arms thoughtfully across his chest. The executives exchanged unreadable glances, visibly surprised at her frank admission. Caroline realized they had anticipated excuses, deflections, anything but the stark truth she had just laid bare. James exhaled slowly, meeting her eyes directly. "And now?" he asked firmly. Caroline blinked, uncertain. "Sir, what do you plan to do next?" James pressed, his voice steady, assessing her carefully. "You claim you want to demonstrate growth, but words alone won't undo what's been done. What action are you prepared to take?" Caroline hesitated momentarily, feeling the overwhelming weight of the damage she'd caused. Passengers had witnessed her humiliation of Meredith firsthand. The airline's reputation was tarnished. Trust had been shattered. Yet despite everything, Caroline desperately wanted this moment to mark a turning point, rather than a bitter ending. She inhaled deeply, gathering her resolve. "I don't expect to leave here with my job," she admitted, voice firm but tinged with regret. "Nor do I expect immediate forgiveness, but if given the opportunity, I want to help fix the very culture that allowed me to feel justified in my actions." James maintained his neutral expression, silently prompting her to continue. Caroline swallowed again, forcing out the truth she'd come to accept. "This airline teaches us policies, safety, procedures, customer service. But I don't think I ever genuinely understood what it meant to serve every passenger equally. I believed I did, but I didn't. Not truly." She met James's eyes resolutely. "If I'm allowed to stay, I want to actively help change that." The room fell silent once more. Caroline wasn't certain she had said the right thing, only that for the first time her words felt genuine and sincere. James considered her closely, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Wait outside," he instructed. Caroline rose stiffly, nodding respectfully, her heart thudding unevenly. This time the security officers made no move to escort her, a minor relief amid overwhelming uncertainty. As she stepped out into the waiting area, her breath trembled slightly in her chest. Then her gaze settled on Meredith Winslow, calmly seated nearby, poised and patient. Meredith slowly turned her head, meeting Caroline's eyes directly. For the first time since this ordeal began, Caroline didn't try to avoid Meredith's gaze. She didn't look away, didn't pretend she wasn't standing precariously on the edge of losing everything. Instead, she stood quietly, openly acknowledging Meredith's calm appraisal. "They're discussing your future in there," Meredith said quietly, nodding gently toward the glass conference room doors, her tone steady and composed, as though this were merely a casual conversation. But they weren't strangers anymore, not after today. Caroline swallowed tightly. "I understand." Meredith tilted her head slightly, her gaze penetrating yet gentle, filled with a wisdom Caroline couldn't yet grasp fully. "Do you?" Caroline drew a shaky breath. For the first time, she truly faced what Meredith was silently asking. Did she grasp the severity, the deeper meaning behind her actions? She had stood at the precipice of losing it all, convinced she'd done enough to atone. But now, seeing the composed woman before her, Caroline recognized that genuine accountability went beyond apology. It required true understanding, humility, and a commitment to meaningful change. For the first time in her life, Caroline Whitmore realized she was finally ready to embrace all three. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Meredith Winslow asked gently, her eyes steady and patient. Caroline Whitmore hesitated. If Meredith had posed that question just an hour earlier, Caroline would have still been scrambling, grasping desperately for excuses, believing she could somehow argue her way out of accountability. But now, standing here, exposed and vulnerable, Caroline wasn't sure she deserved to keep her job. She exhaled slowly, her throat tight. "I honestly don't know," she admitted softly. "I suppose it depends on whether they believe I can change." Meredith studied her quietly, fingertips lightly tapping against the smooth ivory handle of her cane. "And can you?" Caroline's fingers twitched nervously at her sides, the question echoing deeply within her. "I'd like to try," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm with resolve. Meredith gave a soft hum of acknowledgement, not approval, not dismissal, simply acknowledging the sincerity of Caroline's words. Somehow, that understated sound carried more weight than anything else could have. Taking a slow, hesitant breath, Caroline finally asked the question she'd feared most. "Why did you ask them to give me a chance to explain myself?" Meredith's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, yet something deeply thoughtful. "Because I wanted to see if you'd use that opportunity to defend yourself, or if you'd face the truth." Caroline felt a profound realization settle heavily into her stomach. This was never about Meredith wanting an apology or seeking justice from the airline. She had never needed either. Meredith had given Caroline space to reveal her true self, to confront the ugly bias she had kept hidden even from herself. Meredith hadn't been powerless at that gate. Far from it. She had allowed Caroline to expose her flaws openly, guiding her quietly but deliberately toward true self-awareness. Caroline swallowed slowly. "You could have demanded I be fired immediately," she murmured, confronting the truth head-on. Meredith's calm gaze never wavered. "Yes, I could have." Caroline hesitated before asking the deeper question gnawing at the edges of her mind. "Then why didn't you?" Meredith remained silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and composed. Finally, she answered softly, yet powerfully. "Because I don't believe in allowing people to walk away from their mistakes without learning from them." The words resonated deeply within Caroline, stirring an unfamiliar sensation in her chest. Meredith's actions hadn't been kindness or leniency. They had been purposeful. Meredith Winslow hadn't needed Caroline's apology or punishment. What she had truly wanted was for Caroline to genuinely see herself, and that was precisely what had happened. At that moment, the conference room doors opened abruptly. Caroline turned sharply, her breath catching as James Whitmore stepped out, his expression still unreadable. The other executives filed out behind him, their postures rigid, eyes briefly flickering toward Meredith before settling firmly upon Caroline. Stephen Caldwell remained near the doorway, assessing Caroline intently before finally speaking. "We've reached a decision." Caroline braced herself, fists tightening at her sides. James spoke carefully, clearly. "Effective immediately, you are placed on probation." Caroline's breath hitched, surprised. Probation? She had prepared herself for two distinct outcomes, either keeping her job entirely or immediate termination. But probation was different. It meant something far more complex. It meant she was being offered a chance. James continued, firm yet measured. "You'll undergo extensive additional training, including leadership development and comprehensive anti-bias courses. Your performance and progress will be closely evaluated over the next 6 months. If at any point you fail to meet expectations, your employment will end immediately." Caroline felt stunned. She hadn't anticipated this. Not an easy reprieve, nor total loss. Instead, she was granted a genuine opportunity to demonstrate whether she could genuinely grow and change. The gravity of this decision settled heavily within her. James narrowed his gaze slightly. "Do you fully understand?" Caroline straightened, regaining her composure. "Yes, sir." James nodded once, glancing briefly toward Meredith. "Mrs. Winslow personally endorsed this outcome. Had she preferred termination, you wouldn't be standing here right now." Caroline slowly turned toward Meredith. The older woman's gaze met hers directly, unflinching and calm. Meredith hadn't fought to keep Caroline employed. She had advocated for her to earn the right to remain. Now, the responsibility rested entirely with Caroline. Caroline swallowed hard, sincerity evident in her soft words. "Thank you." Meredith nodded slowly, deliberately. "Make it meaningful," she advised quietly. Then, with a gentle tap of her cane against the polished floor, Meredith Winslow turned and walked away with the same dignified composure she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. The rhythmic tapping of her cane gradually faded until she disappeared into the bustling terminal crowd. Standing there, Caroline felt neither resentment nor relief. Instead, she felt small. Not the humiliation she'd felt earlier when confronted by the passengers, nor the embarrassment when reprimanded by Richard, but the humbling recognition of how much she still had left to learn. She had spent years believing she knew everything about her role, convinced she could judge passengers at a glance, believing she possessed the authority to determine who belonged and who didn't. But she had been wrong, and Meredith Winslow had given her the chance to recognize it clearly. James Whitmore's voice cut gently through her reflection. "Report to training headquarters, first thing Monday morning. You'll receive further instructions then." Caroline nodded stiffly, her voice steady but quiet. "Yeah, sir." James regarded her a final moment, exchanging silent glances with the other executives before they collectively departed. Leaving Caroline alone, she exhaled deeply, releasing her clenched fists. She had been granted a second chance, but it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an easy way out. It was a test, a challenge she was unsure she could pass. Around her, the airport buzzed with movement, passengers rushing, announcements echoing. But Caroline remained still, understanding profoundly for the first time that true redemption required genuine, sustained change. This summit, and Meredith Winslow's quiet strength, had given her clarity. To move forward, she would have to first confront herself, honestly. And that, she realized, would be the hardest journey she had ever taken.